Charing Cross is widely known as the very centre of London. But we're going back in time to when this was a rural village on the northern fringes of Westminster. We'll go back to one of the earliest maps of the area. This was a large panorama drawn by artist Anton van der Wijngaarde in 1543. Wijngaarde was a prolific Flemish topographer who made panoramic sketches and paintings of towns in the Netherlands, France, Italy, Spain and England. And for our purposes we'll use his map of London, with extra information from a 1561 survey from Ralph Agas, from which we'll derive more of what you see here. In 1543, Charing was the name of a village. A cross had been built in the 13th century, and frequently the area was becoming known as Charing Cross instead of Charing. On this map you can see Whitehall running due south through the Court Gate. To the east of Whitehall was an area called Scotland's, later called Old Scotland Yard. In the year 1290, Queen Eleanor of Castile, who was the wife of Edward I, died quite unexpectedly near the city of Lincoln. Edward was heartbroken, and he ordered that her body should be brought in solemn procession back to London and be buried in Westminster Abbey. A procession of all the lords and ladies of the day had to walk behind the coffin as it made its way to London, a distance of over 200 miles. Every evening the coffin was laid in a building en route. It was the longest formal procession that England has ever witnessed. One of the stops was Waltham Abbey in Hertfordshire, and the following day the procession walked the 15 miles from there to Cheapside, where the Queen's body lay in the church of St Mary le Bow for the night. On the next day the procession was quite short, being only from Cheapside to the western end of the Strand, where it was laid overnight in the church of the priory of St Mary Rouncible. On the day of the funeral service, the procession completed the short distance from this priory to Westminster Abbey. Edward ordered that every place where Eleanor's body rested be marked with a commemorative memorial. A cross was erected at the village of Charing, immediately outside the priory, and it was the work of medieval sculptor Alexander of Abingdon. There's no longer any trace of the priory and hospital of St Mary Rouncible. Today this would stand at the top of Northumberland Avenue. The priory and hospital was founded in 1231 by William Marshall, Earl of Pembroke, to serve travellers on their way to the shrine of Edward the Confessor in Westminster Abbey. In those days the word hospital simply meant a place where strangers could stay. The word used in this sense became our modern word hostel or hotel. Not so many years after its foundation, in 1290, the priory received its Eleanor Cross. Like most Catholic institutions, St Mary Rouncible did not survive the Reformation, and the priory of St Mary Rouncible was dissolved by Edward VI in 1549. The Strand stretched east from here, and ribbon development could be seen taking place along its length. It would still be a while before large houses lined the Thames behind the road. Incidentally, we said the Strand there, rather than simply Strand, which is more common nowadays. Just to the north of the village of Charing is the church of St Martin in the Fields. There's been a church on this site since at least the medieval period. It was located in the farmlands and fields beyond the London Wall, and it was awarded to Westminster Abbey. It became a principal parish church in the early modern period as Westminster's population grew. Its medieval structure was replaced by the present building, constructed in a neoclassical design by James Gibbs in 1726. Directly north of the cross at Charing Cross was the Royal Mews. The royal falcons and hawks were kept at this site from 1377 onwards, and the name originates from the fact that they were confined there at molting time. Mew is derived from the French verb muer, to molt. The Mews building was destroyed by fire in 1534 and was rebuilt as a stables. it kept its former name when it acquired this new function, and the word Mews took on the meaning as a place for horses generally all over London. There's a road running northwest from Charing Cross which later became the Haymarket, and to the west of that road was St James's Field. The lands in the field were divided amongst several owners, including the Hospital of St James and the Abbey of Westminster. King Henry VIII enclosed this large field sometime between 1536 and 1547 at the time of this map, and created field boundaries. By 1576 St James's Field was bounded by a ditch. To the north was Piccadilly, to the east and west were the roads which later became Haymarket and St James Street, and on the south it was bounded by an old highway which led from Charing Cross past St James Hospital to Hyde Park. St James Hospital stood on the site now occupied by St James's Palace, and it was founded, probably in the 11th century, as a colony for 14 leprous maidens. Since the game Pall Mall was played there, the south section of St James's Field was later renamed Pall Mall Field, and the road next to it became called Pall Mall. Spring Gardens were indeed gardens. They featured a decorative fountain in the time of Elizabeth I that was set in motion by passers-by treading on hidden machinery, either knowingly or unknowingly. We've now completed a circuit of Charing Cross. Let's travel forward in time 200 years. A man called John Rock created a major map of London, and this is the Charing Cross section of that map. The main thing to note is how urban the area has become by 1741. There's a point on the map marking where Charing Cross had been, but the memorial had been destroyed in 1647 on the orders of Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War. Cromwell's star faded, well actually died, and the site of the cross was then occupied by a statue of King Charles I mounted on a horse. This site is recognised by modern convention as the very centre of London. The equestrian statue of Charles I is a work by French sculptor Hubert Lasseur. It was the first Renaissance-style equestrian statue in England, and it was commissioned by Charles I's Lord High Treasurer Richard Weston. It was installed at its current location on the site of the Eleanor Cross in 1675. On the previous site of the priory of St Mary Rouncival, Northumberland House has appeared. This was a large Jacobean townhouse. It was the London residence of the Percy family, who were the Earls and later Dukes of Northumberland. It stood at the far western end of the Strand from around 1605 until it was demolished in 1874. In its later years, it overlooked Trafalgar Square. In the general urbanisation of the area, St Martin's in the Fields is now tucked away up St Martin's Lane, surrounded by buildings. The Royal Mews was rebuilt in 1732 to the designs of William Kent, and in the early 19th century it was open to the public. Kent's redesign was an impressive classical building occupying the northern half of the site. There was an open space in front of it that ranked amongst the few large open spaces at the time when the royal parks were on the fringes of London, and most garden squares in London were open only to the residents of their surrounding houses. There is now a proliferation of mewses in the area. Streets receive their formal names. Cockspur Street, Haymarket, a market of hay had been established there, and Pall Mall. St James's Field, now built over, has given way to the fashionable St James area, together with the market. Spring Gardens is now the name of a road, instead of an actual garden. It's 1799 and we have a new map. The Horwood map of that year takes us to the beginning of the 19th century. It's a rather beautiful map, but not a lot has changed since the 1740s. But notably, The map shows the yards of the many inns of the Haymarket. However, the 1865 Stanford map shows huge changes. The whole site of the Royal Mews was cleared in the 1820s to create Trafalgar Square, laid out between 1837 and 1834, and the National Gallery opened in 1838. Nelson's Column was built to commemorate Horatio Nelson's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, after which the square was named. His monument was constructed between 1840 and 1843 to a design by William Railton. To the east, down the Strand, Charing Cross station has been built. In the same year as this map, 1865, a 21-metre tall stone sculpture was placed in front of the station. It was a reimagining of the medieval Eleanor Cross, but on a larger scale and much more ornate. But it's not on the original site, it's 200 metres away, because that's now occupied by King Charles I on his horse. St Martin's in the Fields, by just staying where it was, is now in a prominent position. The coming of the square has rescued it from obscurity along its side road. And speaking of Napoleonic Wars, Waterloo Place has been laid out. The wonderfully detailed mid-1890s Ordnance Survey map sees the disappearance of Northumberland House and a new street called Northumberland Avenue. In previous maps you could see the Thames in the bottom southeast corner, but the Thames has retreated from the scene since the embankment has been built, underneath which is both a major sewer and the district line. Northumberland Avenue connects with this major new road. On the other side of the map, Waterloo Place gained a statue of Florence Nightingale in 1915. It was the first statue erected depicting a female who wasn't a royal. Old County Hall, known as Spring Gardens, was the headquarters of the Metropolitan Board of Works. When the London County Council arrived, the council needed a bigger building, and it moved to the South Bank. What's still missing in action is Admiralty Arch. The Mall doesn't yet reach Trafalgar Square. But by 1950, the Mall does reach Trafalgar Square. Admiralty Arch was designed by Aston Webb. It adjoins the old Admiralty building and was commissioned by King Edward VII in memory of his mother Queen Victoria, although he didn't live to see its completion in 1912. And so we're now up to date. The modern map has largely inherited the built environment of the 20th century. The Second World War didn't cause the destruction here that was seen elsewhere in London. And while our general story is complete, there are many other tales to tell, but that's for another day.